Colorado State University is out with its updated hurricane outlook, and it's slightly lower than about a month ago. I want to bring in now Dr. Phil Klotzbach. He leads the research team at Colorado State University. Phil, thanks for being with us. Can you talk a little bit about this updated forecast and just some of the factors that have gone into the decrease?
Yeah, so we have lowered our forecast just a little bit. We're now forecasting a total of 16 named storms. Of those 16, 8 becoming hurricanes, and of those 8, 3 becoming major or category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. That's a slight reduction from 17 storms, 9 hurricanes, 4 major hurricanes. So basically knocking all the numbers down by 1 from our previous outlook. The primary reason for that is because vertical wind shear in the Caribbean has been very strong in June, and it is forecast remain to be pretty strong through the rest of July. Normally, that is associated with a little bit quieter hurricane seasons. I should also point out that the 16 named storms does include the 3 storms that have already formed, Andrea, Barry, and Chantal, so 13 additional storms this year.
And what about the factor of Saharan dust? I see that there's plenty of it out there. Can you talk to our viewers a little bit about just what that does to storms and how it plays a role?
Yeah, so typically, when we see a lot of dust, especially that the dust moves farther west, more towards the Caribbean, that is associated with quieter overall hurricane seasons. To date, the dust has actually been somewhat below normal, but obviously we can get a lot of dust in July. So typically when you have a lot of dust, you think dry air. Dry air tends to squelch the thunderstorms that are the building blocks of the hurricanes. Also, too, when you get a lot of dust moving into the Caribbean, it tends to be a sign of higher levels of vertical wind shear. Vertical wind shear is a change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too much vertical shear tears apart hurricanes. So it does look pretty unlikely to see much more storm activity through, say, the next several weeks in July, potentially then picking up as we normally would expect it to pick up during August. Normally, June and July are fairly quiet in terms of hurricane activity.
Sure. And normally sea surface temperature plays a huge role. We know that it's slightly not as warm as it was last year, but it's still on the warm side.
Yeah, that's correct. So, thankfully the waters are not nearly as warm as they were last year at this time, but they are still running a little bit above normal. Warmer waters in the tropical Atlantic basically provide more fuel for developing hurricanes. So the waters have cooled off substantially from what they were last year at this time. We've generally had fairly strong winds. Those strong winds blowing across the ocean surface cause a lot of mixing and evaporation. That causes anomalous or cooling faster than normal, which we saw through especially the second half of the winter. Unfortunately, the next couple of weeks, the winds look fairly weak over the tropical Atlantic, so we do expect to see those waters, as you would expect. They obviously always warm from spring to summer into the early fall, but probably going to be warming at a little bit faster rate. I also do want to point out that we don't anticipate El Nino conditions this summer and fall. El Nino is warmer than normal water in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. That tends to increase the levels of vertical shear in the Atlantic. We don't anticipate El Nino increasing shear this summer and fall.
Well, we just had Chantal, and we are now at number 3 on the list, so off to a fairly slow start this season. But I think that the message to the public might be, don't let your guard down yet, right? Because although we're off to a slow start, we look back to 2022 and that first hurricane didn't happen until September, and that turned out to be a really explosive season. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so every season is different, and certainly last year gives a great example of that, where it was extremely busy early. We had the earliest Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic on record with Beryl in early July. But then we went through kind of the climatological peak of the season with very little storm activity, and then finished with an extremely busy end of the season, and unfortunately extremely damaging end to the season, especially with Helene and Milton. So June and July historically are pretty quiet, and in terms of storms, we actually are running somewhat above normal. We don't normally get our third storm until early August. So, usually June and July are fairly quiet. Normally, we do expect the season to pick up in the early part of August. And my mentor, Dr. Bill Gray, who founded these seasonal forecasts at Colorado State, he actually used to ring a bell every year on August the 20th, signaling the active part of the season, because climatologically or on average, that's really when the season picks up.
Oh, yes, we know it well. And, one other interesting thing I wanted to ask you about in your forecast, the fact that the higher probability of U.S. or Caribbean landfalls, it did go up compared to last year. Do you attribute that to rapid intensification, or does that play a role?
So the probabilities for landfall for impacts. So basically, we do impacts, which are storms tracking within 50 miles of basically various parts of the United States and the Caribbean. Those probabilities are actually a little bit lower than they were last year at this time, just because we're not expecting as above normal of a season as what we saw last year. In general, when we don't have El Nino conditions, you tend to get a little more storm activity in the Western Atlantic. So that combined with the fact that we are expecting a little bit of an above normal season do cause these probabilities to be somewhat elevated from, say, like the average hurricane season. But again, typically our most significant impacts are going to come during August, September, and October.
And where would we typically see storms form this time of year?
Yeah, so typically in June and July, you tend to get more storms in the Western Atlantic. And then once you get into, let's say, late July, especially into August, that's when you start to see kind of more storms forming off of the west coast of Africa. Typically, why you don't see storms forming there earlier in the season is just because the waters are too cold and the atmosphere is kind of stable, as well as we tend to have some pretty significant amounts of dust that tends to squelch the storms. Normally, by the time you get in August, those waters warm up, there tends to be less dust. And overall, that's when you tend to get more storms there. Late in the season, the vertical wind shear, so again, those winds that tear apart hurricanes, really increases in the eastern Atlantic. So typically, say once you get to October, you tend to see more storms forming closer in the western Atlantic again, so more in the Caribbean and off the, say, U.S. East Coast, but especially the Caribbeans where you tend to see your most significant storms during the month of October.
Well, you've been at this a long time, many, many years. Can you talk just a little bit about forecasting and how it has advanced really in recent times and how it's changed and become better compared to when you started?
Yeah, you're right. It has been quite a few years, a lot more gray in the sideburns than when I started in this business about 25 years ago now. But things really have come a long way, and I think there's a couple of really big areas I think where we have, I'd say there's three areas that have really kind of grown and really helped us out. One is when we build our models, so the models that we use to forecast hurricane seasons, we use a lot of historical weather data to build these models. And it sounds kind of funny, but we know better kind of what the past look like now than we used to. And that's just because we have better computers, so we have faster computers, so we can better kind of reconstruct what the past looked like given the observations that we had, and then kind of filling in the gaps where we didn't have observations. We also have climate models that can forecast several months into the future. And so when we're looking at these forecasts, we're not looking at, say, the forecast, today's July 9th, the forecast for, say, September 2nd. What we're looking at is, say, a 1 or a 3-month average of things like water temperatures, pressure patterns, precipitation anomalies, things like that. And the models can do a pretty good job of that. One other thing I think that's been really impressive is that we used to say when we put out a forecast on July 9th, we'd say, okay, we kind of know what things are up through July 9th, but we don't really know what things are going to look like, say, maybe beyond about the next week. Whereas now, these models can forecast, say, 2 to 3, even 4 weeks out, especially for tropical weather with reasonably good levels of skill. So we can look and see, for example, July 9th, but we do generally are pretty confident that we are going to see pretty weak winds blowing across the tropical Atlantic over the next couple of weeks, which is one of the reasons why we anticipate the Atlantic relative to normal to be a decent bit warmer relative to normal, say 2 weeks from now, than it is even now.
I know this may be a little out of left field, but just talk about the fact that so many of these storms have become so devastating so far inland. We look back to Helene and just the destruction it caused in and around Asheville. And when it comes to forecasting, the challenges with the inland forecasting.
Yeah, so there are a lot of impacts. So obviously, generally, we think of hurricanes, we think of them being, primarily coastal events, but they can cause impacts very far inland. And so, obviously we even saw that with some of the Texas flooding with some of the remnant moisture from Tropical Storm Barry. And really when it comes to these inland impacts, there are a few different driving factors. So a lot of the times, we think about especially heavy precipitation impacts, that you think about these slow moving storms. So a storm like, say, Harvey or Florence that can bring very significant rainfall totals. When you're talking far inland though, we often talk about what we call these basically pre-events. So in the case of Hurricane Helene last year, we had basically a front that stalled over the southern Appalachians a couple of days prior to when Helene made landfall. Anytime you have a frontal boundary, air is going to go up along that frontal boundary, and when it stalls over mountainous terrain, you're going to get a lot of air rising up over that frontal boundary and raining out. When we call these pre-events, basically what ends up happening is you get all this moisture, say Helene at this point was in the Eastern Gulf, all the moisture from Helene got wrapped up into that frontal area and caused a lot more rainfall. Then after Helene made landfall, it kind of took an unusual track and bent back more towards the northwest. So that low pressure circulation, you have all that counterclockwise flow. So you have all this air basically going back up over the mountains and raining out even more. So that's kind of what really is what caused the catastrophic flooding with Helene. But you can go back even a few years earlier. You think about a storm, say like Hurricane Ida, made landfall in Louisiana, not too far west of New Orleans, because its remnant moisture interacted with a frontal area in the middle, in the eastern United States, and brought tremendous flooding to the mid-Atlantic all the way up into New York City.
What's your key takeaway, even though this forecast has decreased and it's maybe not as a robust year as perhaps last year? What's your takeaway message for everyone watching?
Yeah, so I think, with all of our seasonal forecasts, we emphasize obviously these forecasts aren't perfect. And also, too, it's important to realize that, it only takes that one hurricane making landfall near you to make it a busy season. And say our forecast is perfect and we get exactly 8 hurricanes, we don't know where those hurricanes are going to go. So, we emphasize now is a time to make preparations, have a plan in place, and know what you're going to do if a storm does threaten. And if a storm does threaten, to follow the advice of your local emergency managers.
Dr. Phil Klotzbach, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you.